been waiting all evening to sit in this chair. I'm glad I didn't wear tartan though. Thank you very much, Alan, and can I say welcome to all of you here in the Kelvin Gallery, but also welcome to all of you who are joining us online from around the world. It's wonderful that you're doing this. You know, there's an Irish proverb which goes, and I improvise a little bit, it goes, may you have the hindsight to know where you've been, the foresight to know where you're going, and the insight to know when you've gone too far. And it struck me that this series, The Radical Old Idea, reflects that aphorism absolutely perfectly. The seminal thinking of the moral philosopher Adam Smith has informed what we've since called economics for centuries now, and given most of us some beliefs, some home truths, as it were. That's our hindsight, and that's the context today. Having this conversation, this suite of events in the Radical Old Idea program in the middle of COP26 surely informs us about where we're going, with its spotlight on the inexcusable damage and waste that leads to climate change deriving from overuse and misuse of resources and the inequalities that come with it all, at the same time as COP26 is trying to hammer out ways to address this crisis with urgency and efficacy. Together, that constitutes the foresight. And insight? Well, Anton, that's where you come in, I'm afraid, because Anton will and has written a wonderful essay for the collection of essays considering Book 4 of Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, but with a 21st century lens and against the backdrop of the climate emergency. Historians have argued that Smith had an integrated vision of our social, moral, intellectual, and aesthetic nature, and the all-important core of imagination that humans have. Only humans have that. He was a philosopher. It's been said that economists ignored that perspective and instead took the more mundane handles of free markets, the non-benevolent butcher or self-interest, the invisible hand, and built their science around those concepts. But Anton, I found your essay really interesting because, like Smith, you do reach out beyond the restricted notion of what is economics, and it is incredibly thoughtful. So let me start by asking you what you would consider to be the key concepts or issues in your essay. But first, tell me why you wanted to engage with this.
Well, thank you very much, Susan, and thanks to Jeffy, and also thanks to my two co-authors, Michele Battisti and Craig Smith, because I couldn't have written it without their help as well. Why I wanted to engage with this? Well, I thought it was a fantastic idea. As you say, Smith has been so influential on not only economic thought, but philosophical thought, actually, and through his theory of moral sentiments, also moral philosophy, that I felt it was really important, given what is happening in COP, to engage with this project of why. What might he have said if he was with us today? And he was a really sophisticated thinker, as comes across in The Wealth of Nations. He manages to weave together many ideas, as you say, around philosophy, ethics, and economics concepts. So what do we do in this essay? Very briefly. What do we do in this essay? Very briefly, this is, of course, the book in The Wealth of Nations where Adam Smith riles against mercantilism, against protectionism. And as you say, economists have often taken that bit out of The Wealth of Nations and said, well, this is it. He's basically saying free trade, unfettered free trade should be what matters. And what we say is that it's actually, it's a bit of a caricature. His thought was much more sophisticated. He recognizes the complexity, in fact. In fact, he almost says, in a slightly despairingly, as part of the essay, that he doesn't think that complete free trade is likely to emerge because of competing demands. Now, what we do in the essay, we then say, well, okay, so that was his perspective. He explained how specialization could make a difference to trade. And we then go on to say, well, how has that perspective changed in modern political economy? Because Book 4 is about systems of political economy. And of course, what we've seen, certainly in the last 30 years or so, is more protectionism emerging in political debates in the United States through the election of President Trump, also the UK's decision to leave a free trade area and erect trade barriers, but also elsewhere in the world. You know, protectionism is in the ascendancy. And what we do is explain why that is, because as Smith would have recognized, it is very much around understanding the different forces in systems of political economy, different interests, distributional effects. Because yes, trade in the 20th century has benefited it's taken a lot of the developing world out of poverty, but it's also had distributional effects within the West and within the global North. And we can explore what this means for climate change, because if this is complicated enough as it is at the moment, climate change introduces yet more variables into that system of political economy. And that is something which I think we need to confront as we move towards global net zero.
So you obviously were very taken with the whole concept of doing this, and that is really, really helpful. You said something about free markets, and that he understood you can't quite let them be completely free. But that's true of a lot of his thinking, that it's all much more complicated or complex and textured than just coming up with a particular approach. But let me ask you an odd question. With free markets, there'll be winners and there'll be losers if trade is allowed to take place almost unfettered. And the question is, if that's the case, does it matter, and why does it matter? You mentioned North and South, and I want to get to that in a minute.
It does matter, because what Smith was showing is that at the time when he was writing, essentially what the mercantilist position was doing is it was actually conspiring against the consumer by protecting ourselves against, well, first of all, he made 2 points. One, there was this notion that the mercantilists put forward that effectively trade was a zero-sum game. Yeah. If I gain as a country, you lose. It's the balance of trade is a zero-sum game. And he basically said it's not like that. Specialization can bring is a win-win type situation where both countries can benefit from trade. But that's at the country level. He well understood the distributional consequences. He knew that the merchants that were hiding behind trade barriers would actually benefit from those trade barriers. Even in Book 4, for instance, he rails against the East India Company as a company that exercises a huge market power through trade. So, he perfectly understands the complexity of different interests within a country. Now, what the essay talks about shows that one of the big issues which has arisen, of course, for us, certainly in the latter part of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, in countries like the UK and advanced industrialized countries, is that by importing cheap manufacturers, we have displaced work. We have essentially found that the wages for certain lower and lower middle skill workers have actually plateaued, in contrast to those with higher skills. And many of these jobs have, of course, gone to the Global South, which have benefited the Global South. And there's this Branko Milanovic, who's written this wonderful essay on inequality, shows that it's effectively like the tusk of an elephant. Essentially, a lot of people at the bottom end have been lifted out of poverty. A lot of people at the top end have done well. But in the middle, there's this lowering of the tusk of the elephant. The ones who are lower skilled in countries, industrialized countries, and they've benefited less. They've gone backwards in terms of wealth. And these are the competing interests that, in a sense, Smith was very aware of in his writings.
Yeah. So is it fair to say that Smith was focused on what we in the 21st century would call inequalities? He wouldn't have used that word, but he was focused on that, and not just the uneven creation of wealth or the uneven distribution of wealth, but what happens in society and what happens to society when some gain disproportionately or indeed unfairly. And it does seem to me that that's similar to the debate we now hear about the advanced economies, the northern part of the globe, if you will, not all, but much of it, and the economies that have been held back or even plundered along the way, often in the south, but certainly in a different part of the globe. So the developed and the developing. Would he have, how would he have looked at that as a challenge for us?
I think he would have perfectly understood some of those issues around the developing world. I'll just read you one quote, because he understood how the balance of power mattered in all of this. I mean, and I'm just quoting here, is that he understood how the opening of trade between Europe and America should have been mutually beneficial, according to his theory, but imperialism intervened. And to quote, he says, the savage injustice of the Europeans rendered an event which ought to have been beneficial to all, ruinous and destructive to several of those unfortunate countries. So he understood that it's not just about opening trade, it's about how that is handled and issues around power and who holds that market power.
Yes, and he understood that governments or nations wield power, but they may worry about losing it as they open doors, and there's a kind of inherent conflict. Is that right? Yeah.
Certainly, that's right, and you know, he talks quite a bit about the way in which essentially those interests within a country, effectively through political influence, sought to erect trade barriers. And of course, it took a long time since the writing of The Wealth of Nations before that free trade ideal, or close to the free trade ideal, began to develop, really in the latter part of the 19th century, you know, with the final abolition of the Corn Laws and those remaining barriers to trade.
Yeah. So if we have the developed and the developing, if we have those who've gained and those who have yet to gain or possibly lost, I'll ask the question that is asked at this COP and some previous COPs. Wearing a climate change hat, who has the obligations in that scenario? Who pays for mitigation?
It's a complicated question. So let me first talk about trade, because I think it's really important to establish this, how complicated trade can make that, climate change can make that trade equation. On the one hand, trade could actually be beneficial to us tackling climate change, because what it does is it leads to specialization, resources are used better, and therefore we use less resources as a planet. That's great. However, it's well understood that it can also, if we have different targets, climate change targets around the world, then there's an incentive for companies to effectively offshore dirty industries into countries that have less exacting targets. So you can have carbon leakage, and therefore that then leads to the whole issue of how you run a multilateral trade system. I think, you know, but coming to your question, Susan, because I think it's really important, who pays for this? I think there is a justice question around the fact that the global north has benefited from essentially, you know, having emissions over such a long period of time, historic emissions, and it needs to, I think, address that sort of historic situation. In addition, I think it's, you know, to come back to Smith, it is a win-win. I mean, or is a lose-lose if we don't do it, in the sense that unless the global north can help that transition in the global south, frankly, we will not address the net zero challenge and the race to net zero. There is no way without, I mean, the 100 billion figure that came out in Copenhagen is being used quite a lot. Actually, we know that ultimately that probably wouldn't be enough. It probably will require more. And once you bring in nature and biodiversity, actually, that will be many multiples of that. But unless we do that as a set of industrialized nations in the global north, then we lose. It's lose-lose. And that comes back to Smith's, you know, book 4.
Yes, no, absolutely. One of the themes you pull out in your essay is the fact that Smith, I think you described him as a gradualist, where he was proposing trade should change, international trade should change. He was well aware of the potential impact that change could have, if it happened suddenly, on societies locally in whichever countries were involved, and therefore espoused making that kind of change slowly and gradually. And so I was thinking, still in the climate change space, we need all of this change to happen. You've put a price tag on it and then multiplied by many times, but we can't do that gradually. How do we face into that?
It's really, really tricky, you know, I've heard this said quite a lot over the last week at COP. Yes, you know, the climate change agreements are around making change over 100 years. But as you say, it's what matters is what we do in the next decade. Yeah. I do think, whether it's at COP26 or within the next year leading towards the next COP, we need to absolutely not move from the NDCs, which have been, we have now quite a large number of nationally declared, nationally determined contributions, but we need to look at how these will actually be implemented, and everybody needs to step up to the plate. I think that's important. We need to look at the way in which, as I said, the global north needs to compensate the global south. But we also need to deal, and I think this is where our essay is relevant looking forward, is we need to look at the rules for multilateral trades, because the WTO, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was originally created as part of Bretton Woods, post-Bretton Woods, and the WTO, which it became, isn't set up for this. Yeah. Yes, of course, it has clauses in there. I think it's Article 20 that talks about environmental standards being used as a way of trying to address issues of trade. But it really can't deal very easily with the issues of carbon leakage, with border adjustments in terms of carbon. And all these things have to be fixed, because otherwise we could find that we have a wonderful set of NDCs, we have some implementation plans, and then trade will intervene and actually shift some of these patterns of emissions elsewhere, and will actually create more problems for us over the next 10 years.
Yeah. So there are a number of big international multilateral organizations, the WTO and the IMF and the World Bank, and I suppose the UN might fall under that heading as well from the last century. And you mentioned in your essay the WTO, and that it might need to be revitalized, I think was your word, to face into the issues that we have today. Somebody you may have come across, a professor Ian Golding at Oxford, wrote a book some years ago, a very easy little book to read, where he describes forces which spread around the world and which know no boundaries. So infections, cyber issues, financial misdeeds, migration, temperature change. And he suggested that we may need new international bodies altogether. Now, you're suggesting revitalizing one that we have. Smith was a pragmatist. I think you say that, and it's certainly when you read him. And I think your suggestion of revitalization falls into that camp. Do you think that's doable? Can you take an existing body of that sort that's really entrenched and get it to change for the future?
So here you need an international relations expert as opposed to an economist. However, I think, as I say, given that we need to address these issues over the next 10 years, it would be really, really difficult to think of completely starting anew with a new set of international institutions. Yeah. Bretton Woods, which led to the formation of the IMF, the World Bank, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was done over a period of 2 years by effectively the powers that were going to win the Second World War, and effectively at a time when the sort of bloc that lay outside it, the communist world, was very small, and it was a different set of circumstances. In this set of circumstances, where it's already difficult to reach agreements around climate change, I would find it difficult to think that you start totally with a blank sheet of paper. But it does require to be quite a lot of change in WTO. And again, I'm not a trade lawyer, but if you look at, if I read what has been written by the World Bank and WTO itself, it requires actually a lot of change in some of their articles around allowing things like, carbon border adjustments or carbon taxes. Because at the moment, some lawyers do have the view, and again, not my area, but some lawyers do seem to express a view that actually they're not allowed under WTO rules, so it requires reform. But I would not start with a blank sheet of paper. I would use what we've already got.
Yeah, no, as I say, that does sound pragmatic, and I think Smith would probably have agreed with that sentiment. Staying still in the area of climate change and linking it back to trade, a lot of our conversations are about a just transition. Yeah. And I just wonder if you have a sense of how Smith would have considered the just in that phrase, how he would have described what was meant by that.
Well, that's a really interesting question, Susan. I think again he would have recognized that the distributional consequences are really hugely important. I think, obviously in the theory of moral sentiments, he put a lot of emphasis on this notion of sympathy and what we regard as essentially another person's sort of thought. And I think he would probably have approached this exactly in that way. And again, as something that society as a whole can't simply just leave this to market forces. But having said that, I mean, again, speaking as an economist, one of the things I did write about over the last week of COP is that we do need to understand that distributional issues are easier to address if we can ensure that productivity continues to grow in an economy. Because what I do worry about sometimes is that, there's many ways of transitioning to net zero, and unless we manage to engage with that innovation, that technological innovation that's required, and we manage to grow, countries like the UK manage to grow our productivity, then ultimately it becomes a purely distributional issue. It's a transition to net zero, and that will be really difficult to solve. So again, I think Smith would have had an understanding of that actually it's about the size of the cake, and when you're talking about distributions and just distributions, he would have understood this notion that we should have a path of transition that actually is more likely to allow a just transition, because it will not result simply in a distributional fight.
Yes, yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, and he would have been interested in the opportunity side of, sort of facing into some of the challenges that we have, and would have seen that as creating momentum and possibly positive change. Yes. Absolutely.
No, absolutely. I think, and I think he would have understood the complexity of it, and he wasn't somebody with simple solutions. One of the things we do say in the essay is that, he, and again I'm quoting here, says, he always says we should beware speculative physicians, anybody with simple answers to complex problems. And again, in this climate change space, I do beware of speculative physicians who say, well, it's simple, we just have to do this. Well, it's not actually, it's hugely complex, because there is a transition, there's a need for that transition to be just, there's the complexity of the fact that the whole world has to move at different speeds with adjustments and with fiscal adjustments within countries to ensure that it's just, it's a really complicated problem. So, it was interesting that in book 4 he said, we should be worried about speculative physicians just as much as we should be worried about the interested sophistry of merchants and manufacturers trying to protect themselves. So that juxtaposition is quite interesting.
Yes, no, and you pull that out as well. And is it also fair to say, I mean, I'm always wittering on in the work that I do about the fact that averages are one of the worst things that were ever created, because, we can get a good number if we average everything, but what absolutely matters is what happens on the ends of the continuum. And he would have thought that way as well. Is that right? He would care about those who benefited wrongly or too much, those who lose too much at the ends.
I think he would have. He would have absolutely understood different interests across society, and you're absolutely right about the averages. I mean, actually, if you look at the sort of low growth that we've had since 2008, you see two effects. One is actually the averages are pretty bad for some countries like the UK that effectively have had flatline productivity, which then created some of those social tensions that we then observed. But actually, as you say, what matters more is actually the distributional issues. And it's a very complicated equation as well, because again, there isn't a single cause of that. Trade would have been a small part of that, but there are many other issues around formation of human capital, access to education, many. So again, it's not something where you say, well, let's focus on trade because that tells us what is happening here. He would have been well understood that it's not just about trade, it's about many other factors in the economy.
Yeah, so let me close with just one final question. The last couple of years, it's absolutely put a lens on the disparities in society and the relative agency of richer and less rich countries, relative value of different types of work, and the relative advantages of those with education compared to those without. But in some respects, Smith also shone light on all of those issues, and they matter and they need to be made better and not worse as the world responds to the climate emergency. So a very simple question, Anton, are you optimistic that this can be done? And do you think Adam Smith would have been?
Oh gosh. That's, on Smith, I think I'm gonna pass, because I think he would have probably been. I think he would have been a realist. Actually, when you read The Wealth of Nations, you realize he would have been a realist. Am I optimistic that this can be done? I think we have little choice but to be optimistic, because it's such an existential question. This is not about whether we will be better off in 100 years, in 100 years' time. This is about whether we'll be here in 100 years' time.
Yeah.
And so I think if we can't do this as a human race, and we can't tackle this particular challenge, then frankly, that's we're guilty of a major sin. So I have to be optimistic, I think.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that. So that's really good. Anton, I've got so much more I could ask you, but we have run out of time, and I think we'll have to have another session sometime. Tonight, you've been thoughtful, you've been interesting, and above all, you've been full of insight, which is just what we were looking for and what we need at this moment. Thank you to the university for hosting us, and especially thank you to you.